The classroom was filled with whispers as the new boy walked in, carrying a worn backpack that looked far too heavy for his thin shoulders and the way he glanced around the room made it clear that he already knew. Eyes were on him, judging him, measuring him as if he was an intruder in a place he had no right to be, and when the teacher pointed him to an empty seat at the front, his steps echoed louder than anyone else's, even though he moved carefully as if not wanting to disturb the silence. Yet every footstep felt like a challenge, a reminder that he was different and that difference would not be forgiven easily. The first insult came softly, a muttered word from the back row that made two boys chuckle, and the boy froze but said nothing, and sat down trying to ignore the heat that was already rising in his chest. But ignoring was impossible when laughter followed, and soon pencils tapped against desks in rhythm with his name, a mocking chant growing louder as if his very presence gave them energy to attack, and the teacher either didn't notice or chose not to hear, and in that moment he realized he was completely alone in a room full of people who already decided he was less. His fingers clenched around the pencil until it nearly broke, and he forced his eyes to the page where words blurred together because he could not focus the lines of the book. Dancing in a haze of shame and fury, and the memory of his mother's voice filled his ears, reminding him that every step he took into this new school was a chance to prove himself and that no cruelty could erase who he was. But the cruelty came anyway, with every laugh and every side glance and every whisper carrying the sharpness of knives. By lunchtime the crowd had grown bolder. They blocked his path near the lockers, their shoulders wide, their smirks daring him to try and pass, and when he finally tried, one shoved him back just enough to make him stumble, and the laughter that followed was loud enough to drown the hallway in echoes, and someone snapped a picture on their phone, capturing his fall and freezing his humiliation forever, and he wanted to scream, wanted to swing his fists and make them regret it, but he didn't. He kept walking until he found a corner outside where no one could see his face. In that corner he let the tears fall, hot and silent streaks down his cheeks, but even as they fell, another fire rose inside him, something older than fear, something deeper than sadness, and in that fire was a promise he did not yet speak, but already knew in his bones. He would not stay small, he would not stay broken, he would not let them win. And when he lifted his head, his eyes no longer carried only pain, they carried Next day he walked into class again, the same whispers, the same laughter waiting for him, but this time he did not lower his head, he looked straight ahead, his shoulders square, as if daring them to push him again, and though their words still cut, he noticed something he had not before, a girl 2 seats over, watching him, not with pity, but with something like curiosity, maybe even respect, and that flicker of connection was enough to give him strength to last the day. But the bullies were not done, they never were, and when gym class came, they circled him during basketball, calling him names, saying he didn't belong on the team, that he should quit before he embarrassed himself, and the coach looked away as if confrontation was too much trouble, and the ball was passed to him with deliberate cruelty, and when he caught it, he felt every eye in the gym burning into him, waiting for him to fail, but instead of freezing, he ran, dribbling faster than they expected, his body moving with a speed they had not seen, and when he leaped, and the ball slammed through the hoop, the silence that followed was the first victory he had tasted since walking into this school. The silence did not last, of course, because silence turns to anger when pride is wounded, and one of the boys shoved him hard after the play, knocking him into the floor and muttering that this was just luck and that next time he would pay, and the coach finally blew the whistle. But the damage was done because everyone had seen the new boy rise for a moment above their cruelty, and that moment planted something dangerous in the air, a shift they could not control that night at home. He sat with his mother, who asked if everything was okay, and he wanted to lie to protect her from worry, but the truth spilled out in pieces. The laughter, the shoves, the threats, and her face grew tight with anger and sadness, but also with a calm strength as she placed her hands over his and told him he was not made to break, he was made to fight and survive, and that every insult thrown at him was fear in disguise, fear of his strength, fear of his difference, fear of the light he carried. And he believed her, because in her eyes he saw the reflection of the man he could become. The next morning he woke before the sun, his body buzzing with restless energy, and he stared at himself in the mirror, not seeing the broken boy from before, but seeing the beginning of something else, a spark that refused to be put out, and he whispered to his own reflection that he would rise, no matter what they did, no matter how they tried to bury him, he would rise, in his own voice. Echoing in the quiet room felt like a vow carved into stone. At school, the storm was waiting again. Insults sharper than before, laughter crueler than before, but this time, he didn't shrink. Instead, he answered not with words but with action, walking taller, moving stronger, meeting their eyes until some looked away. And that was the first real crack in their wall, because bullies feed on fear, and when fear fades, so does their power. And though they didn't stop, he felt the balance shift ever so slightly, and it gave him hope. By the end of that week, something unexpected happened. One of the The smaller boys from the group approached him quietly when no one else was around, and muttered that the others were planning something bad after school near the parking lot, and his stomach tightened with dread, but also with resolve, because he knew running was not an option. Not anymore. If they wanted to test him, then they would see what he was truly made of. When the bell rang and the students poured out into the afternoon light, he walked slowly to the parking lot, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest, and there they were, the bullies lined up with cruel grins waiting to corner him, and his hands shook, but not from fear, from anticipation, because deep down he understood this was the moment that would decide everything. Either he would be broken once and for all, or he would rise and leave them speechless forever. And, as he stepped forward, the air itself seemed to thicken, carrying the weight of all the hatred he had endured and all the strength he had gathered. And in that heavy silence just before the storm broke, the boy lifted his chin and smiled a small fierce smile that none of them expected, and it was that smile more than anything else that made the first cracks appear in their certainty, because for the first time they realized the boy they thought was weak had found something stronger than their cruelty, and they did not know what was about to come. Next, the parking lot shimmered with the last glow of the sun sinking low behind the school building, and the shadows of the bullies stretched long across the cracked pavement, as if even the earth itself was warning him of what was coming yet. He did not falter. He kept walking step after step until he was close enough to see the sneers twisting on their faces and hear the muttered curses that dripped like poison from their lips, and though fear clung to his chest like a heavy chain, he refused to show it. He forced his shoulders back and his eyes steady, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing him tremble. One of the boys, the tallest, with a scar on his cheek and eyes like cold stone, stepped forward first, and the rest followed, like wolves circling their prey, their laughter low and mocking, and one spat at his feet, saying he did not belong here, that he should go back to wherever he came from, that no one wanted him here. And the others laughed louder, but inside the boy felt something harden, not just anger, not just hurt, but something deeper, a rising flame that told him this was the moment he had to stand firm, because if he bent now, they would own him forever. He remembered his mother's words from the night before, her voice calm but fierce, telling him that every insult was fear in disguise, and he clung to that truth like armor. So when the boy with the scar shoved him hard enough to nearly knock him off his feet, he caught himself, and instead of retreating, he stepped forward into the space between them, his eyes locked and his jaw set. And he said in a steady voice that shook more with power than with fear, that he would not be broken, he would not bow, and if they wanted to fight, then they would see just how strong he really was. For a moment, the circle faltered, because they had expected silence, or tears, or retreat, but not defiance, not strength, not words spoken with fire, and that hesitation gave him courage. So when the first punch came swinging wild at his face, he ducked low, feeling the wind of it graze his cheek, and his body moved faster than he thought possible, driven not by training but by survival and rage, and he shoved back, hard, catching the boy off guard, sending him stumbling backward into the arms of the others, and the laughter died in their throats, replaced by surprise, but surprise turned to fury quickly, and the pack closed in fists, flying kicks striking from every side, and the boy braced himself using every ounce of strength. He had to block, to push, to fight, and though pain exploded across his ribs and his jaw, he did not collapse. He refused to give them that victory, and each time they thought he would fall, he rose again, his breaths ragged, his eyes blazing, until finally, one of his wild swings connected with the nose of the boy who had spit at him, and blood gushed down the bully's face, shocking everyone into silence. That silence was everything. It cracked the air like thunder, because in that moment they realized the new boy was not weak, he was not prey. He was a fighter, and though bruised and battered, he stood tall in the center of the circle, his fists clenched in his chest, heaving like a warrior who had faced death and refused to die. And even the tallest with the scar took a step back, his eyes flickering with uncertainty, though his mouth still tried to curl into a sneer. The standoff might have dragged longer, but the sound of a car horn shattered the air, and everyone froze as a teacher's voice rang out across the lot, demanding to know what was happening, and the bullies scattered like rats, fleeing light, muttering threats as they disappeared into the dark, leaving the boy standing alone, bruised, bleeding, but still unbroken. And when the teacher rushed over, eyes wide with shock at the state of him, he simply shook his head, saying he was fine, even though his body screamed otherwise, because he knew this was not the end, this was only the beginning. That night he could barely move his muscles, aching, his face swollen. But when his mother saw him, she did not cry. Instead, she cleaned his wounds with gentle hands, her eyes burning with pride and sorrow all at once, and she told him that what he had done proved his spirit was stronger than their hate, and that the world might try to break him again and again, but as long as he rose after every fall, he would always be the one who truly won. And he believed her, because deep inside he felt the truth of it pulsing with every heartbeat. The next morning, whispers spread like wildfire through the school hallways about the fight in the parking lot. Some said the new boy had been beaten badly, others said he had stood his ground like no one else had ever dared, and by lunchtime, the story had twisted into something larger than life, half legend, half rumor, but every version ended the same, with the boy who was supposed to break, standing tall, and that truth shook the bullies more than any punch ever could, because their power came from fear, and fear was crumbling. They were not done, they never would be done, because pride wounded is more dangerous than pride intact. And in the following days, the boy felt their eyes burning holes in his back, felt their whispers sharpen like knives behind him, felt the tension coil tighter with every passing hour, as if the storm was not over, only waiting for the right moment to strike harder, fiercer, determined to crush him for good. And though dread gnawed at him, he also felt a strange strength building, as if every trial was forging him into steel in class. He focused harder than ever, his mind sharp despite the pain, his hand steady as he wrote answers on the board, faster than some of the others could follow, and teachers began to notice the spark in him, the determination that set him apart. And while some still ignored the cruelty swirling around him, a few began to watch more closely, seeing what others tried to hide, and one even pulled him aside, telling him quietly that brilliance was often born from struggle, and that he had something no one could take away, no matter how hard they tried. The girl who had watched him from 2 seats over approached him finally, her voice soft but firm, saying she had seen what he endured, and that it wasn't right. And for the first time he felt the weight lift slightly, because her words were not pity but solidarity. A hand extended in quiet strength, and though trust did not come easily, he nodded grateful, because even a single ally felt like a fortress in a world where enemies lurked around every corner. And in her eyes he saw something honest, something unafraid, and it gave him a flicker of hope. The days blurred together in a haze of whispers and threats, but each night he stood in front of the mirror repeating the vow he had made to himself, that he would rise no matter what, and that vow became a shield stronger than any words they could throw. And slowly he noticed small shifts, subtle but powerful, the way some students began to look at him differently, not with scorn, but with curiosity, maybe even admiration, the way a few stayed silent instead of laughing when insults were hurled, the way cracks formed in the walls the bullies had built. Yet the bullies saw those cracks too, and their anger grew hotter, their plans darker, until one day he overheard them whispering about a trap more dangerous than a fistfight, something that would not just humiliate him, but destroy him completely. And though fear coiled tight in his stomach, he knew he could not back down, he could not run, because every step forward, every battle endured, was proof that he was more than their hate, and that his rise had only just begun. So, when the final bell rang that Friday, and the whispers followed him out into the gray afternoon sky, he walked with his head high, his body sore but his spirit unbroken. And in the distance he saw them waiting again, this time not just with fists, but with something else hidden in their smirks and the shadows behind them. And though his chest tightened and his pulse roared in his ears, he smiled that same fierce smile he had worn in the parking lot, because he knew that whatever trap they laid, whatever cruelty they planned, he was ready to face it. As he stepped forward once more into the storm, the air around him seemed to hum with electricity, the promise of something bigger than a fight, the promise of transformation, the promise that soon, very soon, the bullies who thought they owned him would see the truth with their own eyes, and the truth would leave them speechless. Then gray afternoon stretched into a heavy silence as the boy walked toward the edge of the parking lot, where the bullies stood waiting, their shapes dark against the fading light. And though his chest ached with every breath, and the bruises from the last fight still throbbed under his shirt, he did not turn back. He kept moving, each step deliberate, as if testing his own courage. In every shadow that crept along the pavement whispered danger, yet his eyes remained steady, because he knew that, once again, this was not about fists or insults, it was about survival of spirit and survival of dignity. The tallest boy with the scar stepped forward, his smirk sharp and cruel, and in his hand was not just clenched anger, but something worse, a phone glowing bright in the dim light, recording, ready to capture whatever humiliation they planned. And the others laughed, circling like vultures, one holding a can of spray paint, another with a slingshot and stones. And the boy realized, with a sick twist in his gut, that they wanted more than bruises, they wanted a show, they wanted to carve his shame into memory for everyone to see and share. His throat tightened as the circle closed in, and the talus sneered, telling him this time no teacher, no parent, no miracle would save him, and that the whole school would finally know who he really was, weak, broken, nothing. And the words slashed through the air, sharper than fists, but instead of shrinking, he inhaled deeply, pulling in the fire that had been growing inside him since the first day he stepped into this hostile world. And he thought of his mother's hands cleaning his wounds, her eyes filled with strength, and he thought of the girl's quiet voice saying it wasn't right, and he thought of the mirror where he had whispered his vow, and with all of it gathered in his chest, he met their eyes and said they could record all they wanted, but they would never break him. The laughter faltered for a moment, because confidence was the last thing they expected, and the boy with the spray paint growled, stepping forward, ready to mark him like property. But the boy moved faster than fear allowed, knocking the can from his hand with a sharp shove, and the hiss of paint spraying across the pavement instead of his skin sent a ripple of shock through the group. And in that moment, he felt the first crack appear in their power again, but rage replaced shocked quickly, and the one with the slingshot raised it aiming for his face, a stone gleaming cruelly in the fading light. And before it could fly, the boy lunged forward, tackling him to the ground, the stone clattering harmlessly away, and the phone, still recording, caught. Not humiliation but resistance captured his fists, clenched his eyes, blazing, captured the truth that he would not be prey, and though fists and kicks rained down on him, again he refused to stay down. He pushed back with every ounce of strength until the pack began to stumble, not from his blows but from the realization that he would not surrender. The noise of the struggle drew attention, footsteps running, voices shouting, and soon other students gathered at the edges, phones raised, eyes wide as they watched the fight unfold. And the bullies, who had wanted a show, suddenly realized the show was not theirs to control anymore, because the crowd was watching, not the weakness of the new boy, but his defiance, his strength, his refusal to be erased. And the whispers in the crowd carried not laughter but all blood dripped from his lip, his knuckles raw, yet he stood again and again. Every time they thought he would collapse, he rose, and the tallest boy with the scar finally lunged with a roar, grabbing him by the shirt and slamming him against the wall. But even then the boy's eyes never lowered, never broke, and he said through ragged breaths that no matter how many times they tried, he would always rise. And those words echoed louder than fists, louder than threats, and the crowd fell into silence because they felt the weight of truth. In the distance, the wail of sirens began to cut through the tension. Someone had called for help, and the bullies froze, knowing that punishment was coming, and fear flickered in their eyes for the first time as they scattered into the shadows, trying to flee before the police arrived, leaving the boy bruised, bloodied, but standing tall in front of everyone, his chest rising and falling like a drum of survival. And in that moment, phones captured an image that would not vanish, an image of strength, carved out of cruelty, an image that would soon spread farther than the bullies ever imagined. When the officers arrived, questions flew, but the boy said little, his voice tired yet steady. And when his mother rushed to the scene, her hands trembling, her face pale with fear, she held him close, but he whispered that he was not broken, that he had stood his ground. And her tears fell, not just from sorrow but from pride, because she saw the boy she had raised turn into something more, something unshakable. That night the videos spread across social media faster than whispers in the hallways, clips of the fight, clips of the boy refusing to fall, clips of his defiant words, standing like armor against cruelty. And though many commented with shock, and some with cruelty, others with admiration, the truth was undeniable. The story had escaped the walls of the school and reached beyond, and people who had never known his name now knew his strength. The following days carried a strange shift in the air. Some students who once laughed now stayed quiet. Some even nodded at him with hesitant respect, and teachers who had turned away before now looked at him differently. Though the bullies still lurked in shadows, their pride shattered and their anger festering, the boy knew he had forced a change, not just in them, but in the entire school. He had torn away the mask of invulnerability they wore and shown everyone that they could be challenged. It, the victory carried weight, heavy and unrelenting, because the bruises still throbbed and the whispers of danger had not vanished. And one evening while he sat at the kitchen table with his mother, she asked him softly if he was afraid, and he admitted that yes, fear still lived in him like a shadow, always ready to whisper doubt, but alongside it lived something stronger, a flame that refused to die. And she squeezed his hand, saying that courage was never the absence of fear, but the choice to rise in spite of it. And he believed her, because each day he felt that truth more deeply. The girl who had spoken before sat with him at lunch, now unafraid of the whispers that followed her, and she told him she had shown the video to her older brother, who said that the boy had more strength than most grown men, and that one day people would see him, not as a victim, but as a leader. And the boy listened quietly, his heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and disbelief, because part of him still felt like the lonely child in the corner, but another part was beginning to see what they saw, the beginnings of a rise no cruelty could stop. But the bullies had not disappeared. Their pride demanded vengeance, and in hushed corners they plotted something darker, more dangerous, something that would not only bruise his body, but threaten his very place in the school, perhaps even his future. And though whispers of their plan reached him, he did not flinch, because he knew running would only feed them, surrender would only fuel them. So instead, he prepared himself, steeling his heart and sharpening his resolve, because he understood now that this battle was bigger than a fight in a parking lot. It was a battle for his dignity, his identity, his right to exist without chains. And as another week closed and the shadows deepened again around him, he felt the storm gathering heavier than before, the promise of a confrontation that would either shatter him or cement his rise. And though fear curled in his chest like smoke, he lifted his chin once more, whispered his vow to the mirror once more, and walked forward into the unknown with fire in his eyes, because he knew that the moment was coming when the bullies would unleash their darkest strike. And when that moment came, his response would leave them speechless. The whispers of danger grew louder as the days passed, each hallway carrying the weight of unseen eyes, watching him with malice. And every time he opened his locker, he half expected something to tumble out. Every time he walked home, he felt footsteps behind him that vanished, When he turned yet despite the shadows thickening around him, he did not retreat, his head held high, his vow alive in his chest like a heartbeat, reminding him that he would rise no matter how dark the night became. The bullies gathered in secret corners, their whispers sharp and venomous, their pride burned by humiliation, their fury demanding vengeance, and one evening, he overheard them from the stairwell, their voices low but clear enough to slice into him like a blade. They were planning not just another fight, not just another trap, but something far more devastating. They wanted to frame him, to twist lies into truth, to make the school believe he was not a victim, but a monster. They whispered about planting stolen items in his bag, about spreading rumors that he had threatened them with violence, about turning teachers and students against him, until he had no place left to stand. His stomach knotted with dread because fists he could face, but lies were a poison that seeped deeper than bruises could ever reach. Yet as he gripped the stair railing, he whispered to himself that he would not bend, that if they tried to paint him as guilty, he would fight not only with strength, but with truth, because truth was the only weapon sharper than hate. And though fear gnawed at him, he felt fire rise alongside it. Then, next morning, the trap sprang, a teacher pulled him aside. His eyes narrowed, his voice cold, accusing him of stealing equipment from the gym locker room, items found in his own bag, items he had never touched, and the boy's voice shook with fury as he denied it. But the smirks on the faces of the bullies, watching from the hallway, told him exactly who was behind it, and rage swelled inside him, not just for himself, but for the injustice of it, for the way lies were given more weight than his truth. He was sent to the principal's office, the air heavy with suspicion, and as he sat there waiting for judgment, his fists clenched on his knees, he thought of every insult, every shove, every bruise, and he felt the crushing weight of the possibility that their trap might work, that he might lose everything, his chance at school, his chance at a future. Yet as despair threatened to consume him, he closed his eyes and remembered his mother's voice telling him he was made to survive, made to rise, and that memory steadied him like an anchor. When the principal finally entered, stern and cold, the boy lifted his chin and spoke with a clarity he did not know he possessed. He told the truth of the lies, told the truth of the threats, told the truth of the fight, not with anger, but with steady conviction, and though doubt lingered in the air, something in his eyes, something in his unshaken voice, planted hesitation in the principal's mind, and before judgment could fall, another knock came at the door. It was the girl, her face pale but her eyes fierce, and in her hand was her phone. She had recorded the whispers the night before without them, knowing she had caught the bullies planning the trap, their voices unmistakable, their cruelty undeniable, and when she played it aloud, the room froze, the truth crashing down like thunder, and for the first time the boy saw fear flicker in the eyes of authority, not fear of him, but fear of the truth they had nearly ignored, and the principal's face shifted from suspicion to shame. The bullies were called in their smirks, faltering their lies, unraveling as the recording played, and though they tried to twist their words, the evidence was too clear, and one by one, their bravado cracked, replaced by excuses, replaced by silence, and the boy stood taller in that moment than he ever had before, not because he had struck them with fists, but because he had stood firm long enough for truth to shatter the walls they built. But victory did not erase the scars. The rumors still lingered, some students still whispered that he was troublesome, still looked at him with doubt, and that cut deeper than fists, because he knew that reputation once stained was hard to cleanse. Yet as he walked through the hallways, bruised but unbroken, he felt the weight of respect from others, the quiet nods, the murmurs of admiration, the way a few more began to stand near him instead of turning away, and though the bullies still seethed in corners, their power was bleeding out drop by drop. That evening at home, his mother held him close, her eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow but of pride, saying that truth had prevailed only because he had refused to give up, refused to surrender, and she told him that battles of fists may leave bruises, but battles of lies tested the soul, and he had passed, and though exhaustion clung to his bones, he smiled because he knew she was right. He had not only survived, he had risked. Yet the story did not end there, for wounded pride festers and hatred cornered becomes more dangerous, and the bullies whispered again, plotting not with lies, this time, but with violence darker and more final than before, and though he did not know the shape of their plan, he felt it in the air, a storm gathering heavier than any before, and he steeled himself once more because he understood now that his journey was not just about surviving, but about transforming, and he vowed that when the final storm came, he would stand in its center, unbroken and unstoppably. And so as the days stretched on, and the tension thickened again, he continued to walk forward, head high, fire burning in his chest, knowing that the next chapter would bring the greatest test yet, one that could either shatter him or solidify forever the truth of his rise. The air around the school grew heavy with a strange tension, as if the walls themselves could sense the storm that was about to break, and though the boy walked with his head high, his spirit steady, he could feel eyes following him, sharper than knives, whispers slithering like snakes through the hallways, and he knew the bullies were not finished. Their pride had been crushed too. deeply for them to walk away quietly. Their silence was not surrender, it was planning, and he braced himself for the strike. He knew was coming each day. The pressure grew. The way they lingered at the edges of the cafeteria, the way they leaned against lockers when he passed, their smirks hiding something darker, and though they no longer dared to attack him openly after being exposed for lies, he could feel their hunger for revenge tightening like a noose, and he carried that weight into his nights, whispering his vow to the mirror again and again, that he would rise no matter what, that he would not be broke. Then, one Friday, as the sky turned gray and thunder rolled distant, he found a note, slipped into his locker, the paper crumpled, the writing jagged. It told him to meet them behind the gym after school or else. And though dread twisted in his stomach, he knew this was the moment they had been building toward, the final strike, and he could not hide because hiding would mean surrendering everything he had fought for so far. So he folded the note carefully and slipped it into his pocket, his eyes steady with the fire of decision. The girl saw the tightness in his jaw during class and asked quietly what was wrong, and though part of him wanted to keep her safe, to keep her far from the danger, he told her the truth, because he had learned that carrying the weight alone was its own kind of prison. And her face paled, but her eyes grew fierce, saying that he could not face them alone, not this time, and though he insisted he had to, she promised that even if he asked her not to come, she would be near, and in her words he felt strength, not weakness, and he did not argue further. When the final bell rang, he walked slowly to the back of the gym, the world outside eerily quiet, as if the storm was holding its breath, and there they were waiting, the bullies lined up, their faces cold and hard. No laughter this time, no mocking, only grim intent, and in their hands were not fists but chains and sticks stolen from somewhere heavier, more dangerous, and his pulse thundered in his ears, but he did not stop. His steps carried him forward until he stood before them, his body trembling with fear, but his spirit fierce. The tallest, with the scar, stepped forward, his voice low, telling him that this was the end, that they would make sure he never dared to rise again, that no one would ever see him as strong, that all anyone would remember was his fall. And the others growled in agreement, circling tighter, the chains rattling, the sticks thudding against their palms, and for a heartbeat, despair threatened to drown him, because this was no longer a fight of fists, this was war. Yet, as fear clawed at him, he heard his mother's voice echoing inside his mind, telling him he was made to survive, made to fight, made to rise, and he felt her strength fill him like a shield. And he remembered the girl's eyes full of defiance, and he remembered the crowd that had seen him stand tall, and in that memory, he found his power. So when the first chain swung toward him, he ducked, the metal whistling past his ear, and he surged forward, tackling the boy, holding it to the ground, with a force born not of rage, but of survival. The fight erupted, chaos breaking loose, as fists and sticks and chains filled the air, and the boy fought with everything he had, every bruise, every insult, every lie fueling him as he swung and shoved and clawed his way through the storm, his body screaming with pain, but his spirit refusing to collapse. And though they were many, and he was one, he rose again and again. Each time they thought they had crushed him, he rose like fire, refusing to be smothered. Then a voice rang out sharp and fierce from the shadows. It was the girl. She had brought others with her, students who had seen enough, who had heard enough, who were tired of silence, and together they rushed forward, breaking through the circle, scattering the bullies with shouts and blows, the balance shifting like a tide as the pack realized they were no longer feared, no longer invincible, and panic flickered in their eyes as they stumbled back. The tallest boy swung one last time, his chain glinting in the dark, but the boy caught it, his hands bleeding as the metal cut into his skin, and he yanked hard, pulling the bully off balance, slamming him to the ground, and standing over him, he said with a voice raw and fierce that they could try 1,000 times, but they would never break him, and the words carried like thunder through the night, silencing everyone for a heartbeat. Sirens wailed again, closer than before. Someone had called for help, and the bullies fled, scattered into the shadows, leaving behind the echo of their defeat. And the boy stood there, bruised, bloodied, but alive, surrounded not by enemies now, but by allies who looked at him not as weak, not as different, but as unbreakable. And in their eyes he saw the truth. He had been searching for the proof that rising was not just for himself, but for others too. That night at home, his mother held his torn hands in hers, her tears falling onto his skin, and she whispered that he had carried not only his own weight, but the weight of everyone who had ever been crushed by hate. And he felt the truth of her words deep in his chest, and though his body ached, his spirit burned brighter than ever, because he knew the storm was nearly over and the dawn was waiting. Yet, even in victory, he sensed that the final chapter was still to come, because though the bullies had been scattered, their pride had not died, and the wounds of hate do not heal easily. They fester and twist, and he knew they would try one last desperate strike. But now he also knew something else, something stronger. He was not alone anymore. He had allies, he had truth, and he had a fire inside him that nothing could extinguish, and with that fire, he was ready for the final test. The weekend that followed the brutal clash behind the gym felt heavier than any before. The boy's body ached with every step and every breath, but inside his chest there was a fire burning, steady and bright, because for the first time he knew without doubt that he was no longer alone. The girl had stood by him, the other students had risen when silence could have kept them safe, and though the bullies had fled, their faces, twisted with fear and fury, he sensed they would not stop until they made one last desperate move. Yet he was not the same boy who had walked into this school on the first day with bowed shoulders and silent lips. He was something stronger, forged by pain and defiance. Monday morning, the hallways buzzed with whispers louder than before, but the sound carried a different tone. Students speaking his name, not with mockery, but with awe, their eyes following him with respect. Their voices filled with stories of what they had seen, stories of how he had refused to fall even when chains and fists rained down, and as he walked past the lockers, bruised but unbroken heads turned, and some even nodded quietly, offering him recognition that he had once thought impossible. And though doubt lingered in a few corners, he felt the tide had shifted. The bullies still lingered too. Their pride shredded, their power cracked, yet not destroyed, their eyes burning with hatred whenever they looked at him, their whispers promising one last strike. But fear had crept into them too, for they had seen something they could not erase, the strength of someone they tried to crush and failed. And though they plotted still, their confidence was no longer certain, their unity fractured by panic and mistrust, and he could feel it like a scent in the air. Then came the day when everything would be decided, the sky dark with clouds, lightning rumbling in the distance as if the earth itself knew what was about to happen. After school, the boy walked slowly toward the exit, his bag slung over his shoulder, his mind sharp, his heart pounding, because he knew they would not let the day end quietly, and he was right, waiting near the edge of the field. The bullies stood again, but this time fewer in number, some too afraid to return, yet the tallest with the scar still there, his jaw tight, his eyes desperate, clinging to control that was slipping away. He stepped forward, his voice low, filled with venom, telling the boy that this was the final moment, that they would erase every shred of respect he had earned, that they would make sure he never forgot who truly ruled this place. And behind him, two others shifted nervously, chains in their hands, but their smirks gone, their bravado cracked, and the boy saw the truth in their faces. They were not certain anymore, they were clinging to the last threads of their crumbling power. The boy stood tall, his body aching but his eyes fierce, his voice steady as he said that they could try again and again, but he would never bow, never break, never surrender, and that every time they struck him down, he would rise and rise again, until nothing they did could touch him. And the words cut through the air like thunder, the crowd of students gathering at the edges, holding their breath, their phones ready, but their hearts pulled into the moment, because they knew this was not just a fight, it was the end of something old, and the beginning of something new. The tallest lunged, fists flying, chains whipping through the air, but the boy did not flinch. He blocked, he dodged, he struck back with every ounce of strength left in him. Each move fueled by every bruise, every insult, every lie, until finally, with one last surge, he slammed the chain from the bullies' hands, sending it clattering to the ground, and with it fell the last illusion of control. The crowd roared, not with laughter, not with mockery, but with awe, as the bully stumbled, his power stripped bare, his pride shattered. Silence followed, heavy and absolute, the kind of silence that holds the weight of change. And the boy stood tall, his chest heaving, his eyes blazing, as he looked down at the bully who had tried to destroy him, and he said in a voice raw but unshakable that they could call him weak, they could call him different, they could call him anything they wanted, but he knew who he was, and nothing they did could change that. And the words carved themselves into every heart that heard them. The bullies fled broken once and for all, their shadows shrinking into the distance, and the crowd erupted, not in cruelty but in cheers, voices rising in support for the boy who had stood alone, and now stood as more than just one. He stood as proof that strength was not in fists or chains or cruelty, but in rising when the world demanded. You fall, and the boy felt the weight lift from his shoulders as tears filled his eyes, not of sorrow but of victory. That night at home, his mother held him close, her arms trembling as she whispered that she had always known he was strong, but now the world knew it too, and she told him that sometimes life tears us apart, so we can learn how unbreakable we really are. And her words sank deep into him, filling the cracks with light and healing, and he realized that though the scars would remain, they were not marks of defeat. They were marks of survival. The next week, the principal called him into the office, not to accuse but to commend his strength, to tell him that changes would be made, that silence in the face of cruelty would no longer be tolerated. And though the boy knew words alone could not erase what had been done, he felt a shift, the beginning of accountability, the beginning of a school no longer ruled by fear and whispers. In the months that followed, he grew not just in strength but in purpose. He joined the basketball team, channeling his fire into every game, stunning those who once doubted him with speed and power and determination, and he became a voice not only for himself but for others who felt small, who felt silenced, standing up when others were pushed down, speaking when others stayed quiet. And his rise inspired more than he ever thought possible. Girl remained by his side, her loyalty unwavering, her courage shining, and together they built something new, a bond forged not in pity but in respect and trust. And though they faced challenges, still they faced them together, and that made all the difference. And so the boy who had walked into the school carrying only a heavy bag and heavier silence transformed into someone greater, someone unshakable. Someone who proved that no matter how deep the cruelty, no matter how sharp the hate, no matter how brutal the fight, the human spirit, when fueled by truth and resilience, can rise higher than anyone ever expects and leave the world not just watching but speechless. The story closes fully. The bullies are defeated. The boy has risen not only for himself but for others. His strength transforms the community. And the emotional lesson is clear. Sometimes pain is the fire that forges us into who we are meant to be. And rising after being broken is the most unstoppable power of all. The end.